So what do you want me to do? Carry on, just carry on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where was it? The swing riots. They were widespread uprisings that involved the destruction of threshing machines by agricultural workers in southern and eastern England, again to protest about machines taking their jobs. In 1834, there was an attempt to form a national union confederation, the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. 6 agricultural labourers, who became known as the Tolpuddle Martyrs, had combined to resist wage reductions and applied to join the Grand National. They were sentenced to 7 years transportation on trumped-up charge of administering illegal loaves. The committee set up to defend the Tolpuddle Martyrs adopted a proposal by William Benbow, who was a shoemaker and radical pamphleteer, amongst other things, to adopt the Grand National Holiday, which was a month-long general strike that they saw as a way to cripple the exploitative economic system and set up an alternative. In the 1830s, British parliamentary constituencies had not changed for 200 years. This meant that the new industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no parliamentary representation, while rotten boroughs such as Old Sarum and uninhabited Hill in Wiltshire had 2 members of parliament. After passing of the Reform Act in 1832, which failed to extend the vote beyond those owning property, the political leaders of the working class decided that they had to act. The result was Chartism, the first working class mass movement in the world. And it sought to change the voting system to give every man a vote and a say in the political running of the country. In 1838, the People's Charter was published, and it set out the movement's aims to give working men a say. They would be able to vote, their vote would be protected by a secret ballot. They would be able to stand for election to the House of Commons because the removal of property qualifications and the introduction of pay for MPs. None of these demands were new, but the People's Charter became one of the most famous political manifestos of the 19th century. Different views existed within the Chartist movement, mainly between the moral force Chartists, who sought to change through argument and debate, and the physical force Chartists, who maintained only an insurrection would guarantee their demands. The rising in Newport, South Wales, saw the last large-scale armed protest in Great Britain and resulted in the deportation for its Chartist leaders. Many of the physical force Chartists were industrial workers seeking to better their pay and conditions. And in 1842, a general strike started in Staffordshire and spread mainly in Lancashire and Yorkshire. It became known as the plug plot because strikers would march from town to town and pull the drain plugs on the boilers in the mills and call on workers to join them. The political demands of the Chartists were soon added to their economic demands. It's a famous statue in Preston of what happened in 1842 when striking workers were fired on by militia. The British workers' movement of the 19th century was shaped by Chartism and its eventual failure. What is important for the development of working class politics in Britain is that trade unions were formed and established before the founding of socialist parties or any coherent socialist movements. There was a rise in mainly craft-based trade unions that sought respectability within the established order. They did not seek to change the system, but to find a role within it. These unions sought to portray themselves as sober insurance societies whose affairs were businesslike and entirely respectable. Improvements in conditions were to be achieved through industrial conciliation and union recognition through legal changes and parliamentary lobbying. The great mass of unskilled workers and, of course, women toiling in sweated workshops were not organised and were largely ignored by the aristocratic craft workers. The Trade Unions Congress, TUC, was formed in 1868, and it did seem like the craft unions reformist strategy was making some gains. The campaign to win over the ruling class to the idea that there was a place for sober and responsible trade unionism within society was meeting with some success. In 1871, the Trade Union Act was introduced, which gave unions partial legal recognition. However, the enclosed world of respectable trade unionism was soon hit by an economic recession. The major depression of 1873 led to widespread unemployment and rocked the craft unions to their foundations. In the face of growing unemployment, workers increasingly began to challenge the respectable trade unionist strategy. From 1880s onwards, there was an explosion in the unskilled organisations that became known as New Unionism. In 1886, a union of seamen was launched. In London, East End women and girls making matches for Bryant and May went on strike. They won their demands and formed a union. This was an inspiration for others, including dock workers, who struck in 1889 and went on to form a dockers' union that immediately began agitation for the 8-hour day. These new unions were distinguished from craft unions in that they were general unions organising unskilled and casual workers. In order to attract the low-paid workers, these new general unions would have low subs or fees, and unlike craft unions, did not depend on insurance benefits to attract members. They used aggressive strike tactics to win concessions from the employers, and from the outset, they were more politicised than the craft unions, because most of those organising the new unions classed themselves as socialist and were often active in socialist political organisations. As a result, general unions, unlike craft unions, began to argue for capitalism to be replaced. The first specifically socialist organisations began in the 1880s. In 1881, H.M. Heinemann, who was a wealthy conservative, who was converted to socialism after reading Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, he founded the Democratic Federation and later the Social Democratic Federation. And he wrote and distributed a book called England for All, which was basically a summarized version of Marx's Capital, but he didn't credit him, so he earned Marx's enmity after that. Many leading socialists at the time joined the SDF, Social Democratic Federation, including the artist and designer William Morris and Eleanor Marx, youngest daughter of Karl Marx. It was funded by Heinemann, but soon Heinemann's authoritarianism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism saw Morris, Marx, and others break away to form the Socialist League in 1885. The Socialist League contained Christian socialists, Fabians, Marxists, and anarchists, and produced the weekly paper Commonweal, funded by Morris. In 1887, the League's membership split ideologically into three factions: parliamentary socialists, anti-parliamentary socialists, and anarchists. By 1889, it had become an explicitly anarchist organisation. In 1884, the socialist group, the Fabian Society, was founded. Immediately on its inception, it began to attract many prominent figures, including George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Annie Besant, who had helped them match women, Ramsay MacDonald, and Emmeline Pankhurst. as well as the Society's lifelong guiding spirits, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. The Fabians wanted progressive social change by gradualist methods. They asserted that it was for the intelligentsia of Britain to lead the political, social, and cultural debate. The Society campaigned for a minimum wage, national health and education systems, the abolishment of hereditary peerages, and the nationalisation of the land. Unfortunately, the Fabians also supported British imperialism as a means of disseminating their enlightened principles of governance throughout the world. In the 1874 and 1880 general elections, the Liberal Party agreed not to oppose candidates who were financially maintained by trade unions. These men became known as the Lib Lab MPs, and their aim was to represent the working class while remaining part of the Liberal Party. Disillusionment with them grew after a series of decisions restricting the activity of unions went largely unchallenged by the Liberal Party. The foundation of the Independent Labour Party in 1893 and the Labour Representation Committee in 1900 undermined the Lib Lab experiment, and eventually it died a death. From its beginning, the Independent Labour Party was never a homogeneous unit, but rather attempted to act as a catch-all party of the working class, advocating a rather vague and nebulous socialist agenda. Keir Hardie, who had been previously elected as an independent MP, was its first chairman. Lacking any real theoretical basis, the fervent and emotional socialism of the ILP could accommodate practically any radical ideas, including temperance reform, Scottish nationalism, Methodism, Marxism, and Fabianism. This odd mixture did have one overwhelming virtue, though. It didn't exclude anyone on purely dogmatic grounds. The Independent Labour Party was actually one of the leading lights in the formation of the Labour Representation Committee in 1900. This was established to coordinate support for union-sponsored MPs to represent the working class. The committee included 2 members from the ILP, 2 from the SDF, 1 Fabian, and 7 trade unionists. It had no single leader, but Ramsay MacDonald was elected as its first secretary. Support for the LRC was boosted by the Taff Vale case in 1901. This was a dispute between striking railway workers and the Taff Vale Railway Company that ended with the union being ordered to pay £23,000 damages to the company. The judgment effectively made strikes illegal, since employers could recoup the cost of lost business from the unions who could not afford to pay it. The acquiescence of the Conservatives and Liberals to the industrial and business interest intensified support for the Labour Representation Committee. In the general election of 1906, the LRP gained 29 seats, helped by a secret pact brokered by Ramsay MacDonald with the Liberals that aimed to avoid splitting the anti-Conservative vote. The 29 Labour Representation Committee MPs immediately formed themselves into the Labour Party. Following the election, the 1907 Labour Party conference passed an ambiguous motion that committed the parliamentary party to follow conference decisions, but left the execution of these instructions to the discretion of the parliamentary leadership. In practice, this gave the parliamentary leaders as much independence as they wanted, while at the same time encouraging socialists to the belief that any victories at the annual conference would directly translate to party policy. Discontent within and outside the party began almost immediately, with criticism of the continued pact with the Liberals and lack of any aggression in debates. This was only exacerbated by the 1907 by-election victory of a man called Victor Grayson, standing as an independent Labour and Socialist candidate in Colne Valley. He refused to accept the discipline of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and his impassioned zeal led to angry scenes in Parliament, and eventually he got suspended. But this contrasted starkly with the attitude of the Labour MPs who felt that he compromised the respectability they craved. In the two elections of 1910, Labour increased its number of seats to 40 and then 42, although the majority of these came about with the change of allegiance of the Miners' Federation and their sponsored Lib Lab MPs from the Liberals to Labour. Almost immediately, growing working class discontent and militancy began to have a direct impact on the party. A period from 1910 to 1914 saw a huge rise in the number of strikes, with more than 3,000 in the period. These strikes involved both male and female workers, many of whom had never been on strike before. The number of working days lost was in the tens of millions, with the percentage of the working population involved in strikes increasing more than 3 times between the first decade of the 20th century and the year 1911. The influence of syndicalism, the idea that through industrial direct action as opposed to parliamentary action was the way workers would gain advances, was growing, and first came to prominence in the 1910 Cambrian Combine strike of South Wales miners, made famous by the event of Tunnipandi, where after a so-called riot, troops were deployed to break the strike. The Labour Party and trade union leadership disliked this new militancy that they could not control. Striking workers ignored their union officials and elected strike committees that often included leading syndicalists, the most famous of which was the highly respected trade unionist Tom Mann. The strikes became increasingly bitter affairs that saw troops deployed and a gunboat anchored on the Mersey in attempt to break the Liverpool general strike. Ramsay MacDonald and other Labour leaders wrote scathing articles and pamphlets decrying the new unrest. Yet at the same time, they could not ignore it, especially when it began to make substantial gains. They tried to gain some support by acknowledging the strength of industrial action, but arguing that it was not enough without parliamentary representation. The Liberal government realised the value of the Labour Party as allies in controlling and containing the militancy. Then in June 1914, the 3 most powerful unions representing the miners, railwaymen and transport workers formed the Triple Alliance, with the threat of joint industrial action that would effectively bring the country to a standstill. Militancy and the number of strikes was expanding, and many workers previously uninvolved were preparing for strike action when the events in Europe overshadowed domestic politics. At the onset of the war, the Labour Party was split into pro and anti-war groups. The majority supported the war. Ramsay MacDonald resigned as leader due to his opposition and was replaced by Arthur Henderson. An industrial and electoral truce was immediately declared by Labour and the TUC. Later, in 1916, when Lloyd George replaced Asquith as Prime Minister, he invited Henderson and 2 other Labour MPs to join the cabinet of a new national government. There were some that were concerned that this would take away Labour's independence and the ability to criticise, but they were in a small minority. With the Labour Party and the TUC now part of the state apparatus, workers, usually under the leadership of the shop stewards committees, increasingly took unofficial action, and the number of strikes rose dramatically. The new militancy was stimulated by the horrors of the war and the feeling that the old order needed replacing, having descended into barbarism. The Labour Party opposed these actions, and even those who were against the war in the Labour Party condemned the rise of the shop stewards committees and the industrial action. Their opposition to the war had not come from any class-based opposition to an imperialist war, but was usually based on a Christian pacifism and ethical grounds. The news of the revolution in Russia was greeted with enthusiasm from across the Labour movement. The Labour Party had always felt uncomfortable supporting a war supposedly for freedom and democracy, while being allied with the autocratic Tsarist regime. Now they felt more at ease. For others, the revolution was seen as just the first step to further changes, not only in Russia, but across the rest of Europe. At a convention held in Leeds in June 1917, these differences were put into sharp relief. Resolutions put forward by Ramsay MacDonald and other Labour Party members stressing the new parliamentary independence were side by side with resolutions calling for the formation of councils of workers and soldiers delegates, like British versions of the Soviets. The gulf between the parliamentary left and the direct action and anti-parliamentary left was as wide as ever. The October Revolution saw an awkward silence from the Labour Party and TUC leadership. They did, however, oppose any military intervention by the Allies in Russia, while workers threatened that action if any munitions were tried to be sent to the counter-revolutionary White armies. With the war drawing to a close, the Labour Party was acutely aware of the rise of the working class militancy. So in a 1918 conference, the party transformed itself from a loose federation of affiliated organisations with no individual membership to a centralised national party with local constituency branches and members, and all subject to party discipline. It also saw the adaptation of the block vote system that gave trade unions a decisive say in decision making. The other major change was the adoption of Clause 4 in the party's constitution that formally committed the party to secure for workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of industry, etc. It was actually drafted by Sidney Webb of the Fabian Society, who saw it as a statement of gradual change to society. For some, the Labour Party declared itself an explicitly socialist party, even though the word socialism did not occur in Clause 4, or indeed in the Labour and New Social Order that set out all of their proposals and how they would be realised. Clause 4 was able to satisfy the socialists in the party and the leadership as well, and the TUC with its vagueness. The formation of local Labour Party branches also undermined the Independent Labour Party, with socialist propaganda now being discussed in the more politically diverse constituency parties of Labour. Two of the great jingoistic themes of the 1918 election were Hang the Kaiser and A Land Fit for Heroes. There was also the portrayal of the Labour Party of being both Bolsheviks and pacifists. Despite this, helped by the extension of the franchise, Labour's share of the vote increased from 400,000 to 2.5 million. Lloyd George's coalition won 484 seats, of which 338 were actual Conservatives. Asquith's Liberals had been reduced to 26, which left Labour as the official opposition, albeit with only 60 seats. Of these 60, only 3 could possibly be considered socialists. The previous leaders of the party, MacDonald and Henderson, actually lost their seats in the election, and the poor performance of the party in Parliament only went to confirm to activists that any pressure on the government needed to come from outside. 1919 again saw a wave of strike action. In Glasgow, continuing agitation culminated in a huge gathering in St. George's Square with a red flag being raised. Tanks were deployed to quell any disturbances, and troops that were dispatched were all new recruits from England, as it was thought local troops could not be trusted. Mining and railways, nationalised during the war, were still in public ownership, but the government planned to return them to the private sector. The miners voted for strike action, demanding shorter hours, more pay, and full nationalisation of the industry. The government staved off this threat by appointing the Sankey Commission to examine the mining industry. The strike was postponed after the government made promises to implement its recommendations. When the report was finally published, it was a massive indictment of the coal owners, and it recommended shorter hours and increased pay for the miners, as well as calling for some sort of public ownership of the mines. The government rejected the findings outright. Lloyd George's coalition came to an end in 1922 when the Tories decided it was no longer of use to them. Bonar Law became Prime Minister and called an election. The result saw a Conservative government with a large majority. Labour increased its share of the vote and got 142 MPs and was now undisputedly the main opposition party. Bonar Law fell ill and resigned as Prime Minister in May 1923. He was replaced by Stanley Baldwin, who then called another election to gain a mandate for his policies. This was a mistake, as it resulted in the Conservatives losing their majority, but remaining the largest party. So with the Liberals, they decided to support the idea of the Labour Party forming a minority government. Both the Conservatives and Liberals calculated that this was the safest time for a Labour administration, given that it would be dependent on them for support. As Neville Chamberlain said, they would be too weak to do much harm, but not too weak to get discredited. Ramsay MacDonald became Prime Minister, and first and foremost, he and his colleagues wanted to be seen as responsible and not a threat to the establishment. Any talk of nationalisation was dropped, and nothing was done about the hated anti-Labour laws, including the Emergency Powers Act that allowed the government to use the army and police to intervene in industrial disputes. In October 1924, the Conservatives and Liberals decided to end the experiment, and a vote of no confidence saw a new general election being called. That returned the Conservatives with a majority of 209 seats. This was the election in which the Daily Mail published a Zinoviev letter, purportedly from the Soviet head of the Comintern, encouraging an uprising in the UK. It was a forgery, and most people knew it, but it was used at the time and in the years following by Labour Party members to explain their defeat, although in reality it played little part in it. Britain had returned to the gold standard, which meant that the pound was overvalued, making exports more expensive. To compensate for smaller profits, the mine owners decided to cut the miners' wages and increase their hours. The miners threatened to strike, and the other unions signalled their intention to support them. The government bought time by introducing a subsidy to maintain the miners' pay and conditions, while yet another inquiry into the mining industry began. The government's plan was to use the next 9 months of the inquiry to make extensive preparations for what they saw as an inevitable confrontation with the unions. The General Council of the TUC did nothing to prepare. Instead, they sought to broker some kind of compromise deal between the miners and the mine owners. But by April 1926, negotiations had failed and 800,000 coal miners were locked out. There were desperate last-minute attempts by the Labour Party to find a compromise to avert a general strike. But by now, the government was fully prepared and had no interest in conciliation. So the general strike began on 3rd of May 1926. The immediate and overwhelming response from the working class surprised both the Labour Party and the General Council and the government. 1.7 million workers went on strike, bringing transport systems and heavy industry to a halt, while no newspapers were printed. The government's plans were implemented with special constables who were middle-class volunteers and the army being mobilised to take on the planned strike-breaking duties. Winston Churchill oversaw the printing of the British Gazette, a daily newspaper that advocated the government's position. Almost immediately, Ramsay MacDonald and the General Council entered into negotiations to bring the strike to an end. They had never wanted to strike, and each day any control they had was passing from them to the organised strike committees, who they dreaded more than the government. After 9 days, the strike was called off without any guarantees for the miners or assurances of no repercussions for the strikers. The belief by both the parliamentary and union leadership that any challenge to the government by working class strength outside of Parliament was simply wrong was strengthened. They shared the government's view that the general strike was a politically motivated and morally reprehensible venture, undemocratic and subversive. In 1928, Labour and the Nation was presented at the Labour Party conference. Attempts to make it more radical were crushed by the trade union bloc votes. In the general election of 1929, Labour were the largest party for the first time and again formed the government. The politics of the second Labour government fell into a pattern of no concessions to the Labour left and the seeking of a compromise with the Conservatives and particularly the Liberals. It followed the economic policy of the previous government and did not even attempt to pursue any of the promises made in Labour and the Nation. The result was continued economic recession that culminated in the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Snowden, and Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald asking the opposition parties to support wide-ranging spending cuts, including a 10% cut in unemployment benefit. Divisions within the Labour cabinet started to appear as the consequences of their policy came to fruition. The opposition parties could have used the weakness of the Labour Party to force them out, but they decided to support MacDonald and Snowden on the condition that the government secure a further American loan. They were more than willing to agree, as they wanted any unpopular measures to come from a Labour government. As it turned out, the splits within the Labour Party meant that the budget could not be agreed. So on the 24th of August 1931, the government formally resigned. The Conservatives had already decided that they would support the formation of a national government to be led by Ramsay MacDonald, and they convinced King George V to ask him to do so. The new administration consisted of members of the Conservative and Liberal parties, as well as a number of what became known as the National Labour Party, formed by Labour Party members who were expelled due to their support for the national government. MacDonald's national government had not intended to fight a general election, but under Conservative pressure, one was called. The 1931 general election led to a landslide victory for the candidates supporting the national government that would remain in power under MacDonald until 1935. This suited the Conservatives, even though they had by far the largest number of MPs. With MacDonald gone, leadership of the party reverted back to Arthur Henderson. Politically, there was little to choose between them. Henderson had cast the only vote for MacDonald to retain his Labour Party membership. but he was seen as a safe choice. The divisions once again emerged in the party, and the Independent Labour Party finally disaffiliated. At the 1931 general election, 5 Independent Labour Party members had been selected and created their own group outside the Labour Party. This caused this was the start of the decline of the Independent Labour Party, who in the next few years lost 75% of its membership to the Labour Party, or the Communist Party of Great Britain, and some Trotskyist groups. Henderson lost his seat in the next election, and George Lansbury became leader. The struggle between the different sections of the party continued, with the left, represented by the Socialist League, gaining influence. In 1934, the party published For Socialism and Peace, the third and most radical statement of policy the Labour Party had published. It called for the public ownership of transport, coal, gas, water, iron and steel, shipbuilding, and several more industries, as well as banking and credit. It also committed the party to the implementation of such measures solely through Parliament, although the Socialist League had argued that such measures could not be achieved without a massive mobilisation of extra parliamentary support. The plans were also criticised for having more in common with a bureaucratic corporate state than with socialism. While this debate was being had about the future Labour government, many outside were having to deal with the economic situation in the here and now. In 1932, the reduced dole and the means test saw widespread unemployed agitation, with meetings, marches, demonstrations, and pitched battles with the police, leading to arrests and prison sentences. The National Unemployed Workers Movement had been founded in 1921 by members of the Communist Party. Because of this, the Labour Party and the TUC would not offer it any support and largely ignored it. With the onset of the 30s and mass unemployment, the TUC decided to try and form an alternative unemployed organisations under local trades councils, mainly to divert support from the NUWM. The TUC then would support resolutions that emphatically protested the treatment of the unemployed and strongly demanded change. Nothing came to this, and it proved far from enough for most activists. Beginning in 1934, a new campaign of hunger marches was instituted, with the first coming from Glasgow. Ramsay MacDonald refused to meet a delegation of the marchers, and a new bill centralising unemployment benefit and the application of the means test was passed, and this caused even more anger. The hunger marches continued, the most famous being the Jarrow Crusade. The TUC and Labour leadership advised Labour parties and trades councils along the route of the Jarrow Crusade not to help the marchers, although many local branches ignored this. After the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, the spectre of fascism became more concerning to the Labour movement. Since 1929, the Communist Party had followed the new line that had denounced any other left-wing parties as social fascists. The consequences of this strategy had been catastrophic in Germany, and after 1933, the orders from Moscow were to change policy and try and form united fronts with other left-wing parties. The Labour Party rejected the Communist Party's overtures and went even further in expanding the number of organisations Labour Party members could not belong to. The Socialist League, in defiance of the ban, launched a campaign to establish a united front. The Labour leadership offered them a choice between disbanding themselves or expulsion. Encouraged by the Communist Party, who had more use for sympathisers inside the Labour Party, the Socialist League dissolved itself, but many Labour Party members did unofficially work alongside Communists and the ILP, and many went to Spain and joined the International Brigade. Then there was another change with calls for a wider popular front and military coalition between Britain, France and the Soviet Union. This met with resistance from many on the left, alienated by the show trials in Moscow and the actions of the Communist Party in Spain. The Labour leadership opposed it on different grounds, citing their traditional independence and arguing that only a Labour victory in the next general election due in 1940 could stop fascism. The Labour Party's initial view towards appeasement was that it was needed by international cooperation. What was needed was international cooperation to oppose Hitler's Germany. This was to change after Clement Attlee became leader in 1935. From then onwards, the party argued strongly against any policy of appeasement. The question of what should be done instead, the early pacifist views were now marginalised. The fading majority view was that disarmament should be pursued by international agreement through the League of Nations. The view gaining strength was that, and what was to soon become the majority opinion, was to support British rearmament. A fourth view was to demand resistance to fascist aggression, but not support rearmament on the grounds that only a Labour government could be trusted not to use the arms for reactionary purposes. When war did come in 1939, the Labour Party refused an offer to join in a coalition government under Neville Chamberlain, while again agreeing to an electoral truce with the TUC renouncing strike action. After the crisis of May 1940 and the backbench Tory revolt, they did enter Churchill's coalition with Clement Attlee and Anthony Greenwood, members of the War Cabinet, and several other ministerial posts being given, including Ernest Bevin becoming Minister of Labour. The mass of working people supported the war, but the Dunkirk spirit invoked by later politicians was double-edged. It combined the determination to defend Britain against the Nazis with a bitter resentment of the incompetence in high places that had led to the debacle in the first place. A very popular short book, Guilty Men, was also published at this time, attacking those who had failed to stop the rise of fascism in the 1930s. Keynesian economics of demand management were adopted by the government. Employers and unions came together in a quasi-corporate alliance. Welfare provisions were extended to meet the needs of the war effort, and prenatal and infant welfare services were improved. Cheap school meals and day nurseries were introduced to help facilitate the entry of women into the workplace. As the war was drawing to a close and thoughts turned to a future general election, the Labour Party began to formulate its ideas for post-war Britain. In 1943, the Beveridge Report on the future of Social Security, Family Allowances and National Health Service had been accepted in principle by all the political parties. There was also reports by various committees on the economy, even the Conservative-dominated ones, that had agreed to some sort of form of nationalisation of industry. Labour went into the July 1945 election on the back of Let Us Face the Future, a manifesto that fell well short of committing the party to full nationalisation and ignored the appeals for some form of industrial democracy involving workers' control. The Labour leadership had not wanted an election, and Attlee and Bevin wanted to accept an offer of a continuation of the coalition, but they were overruled by the Labour National Executive Committee. The Labour leadership did not think they could win, despite the gains made during the war by parties that did not accept the electoral truce, especially the 4 seats won in by-elections by the left-wing Commonwealth Party. In the event, there was a landslide victory for Labour, with a parliamentary majority of 147, and for the first time able to form a government free from the reliance on other parties. There was an immediate blow when the American government announced their end to Lend-Lease aid that was agreed during the war. Maynard Keynes was sent to the United States to negotiate a new loan, but the terms imposed by the Americans were harsh. The Americans didn't want to see themselves funding what they thought was a socialist government. American capitalism had emerged from the war with a dominance that equaled mid-19th century Britain, and they wanted to keep their supremacy. Much has been said about the post-war Labour government, and it is rightly praised for the establishment of the welfare state. There was a consensus across the political spectrum on the need for change. It was an Aaron Bevin, who's very different from Ernest Bevin, the most left-wing member of the cabinet, who was responsible for establishing the National Health Service. There was conservative and medical opposition to the scale and breadth of the NHS, but Bevin appeased the doctors by not insisting on them being a salaried service, and consultants were allowed to keep their private patients and had pay beds allocated to them in NHS hospitals. He also backed down on a plan to include provision for birth control under the National Health Service. The Conservatives' behaviour in trying to sabotage his project left him livid, and Bevan's natural hatred for them was undeniable. At a Labour rally in 1948, he set out his forthright views. So far as I am concerned, they are lower than vermin. They condemn millions of people to semi-starvation. The comments were considered scandalous, but Bevin was unapologetic. The National Insurance Act 1946 provided sickness and unemployment benefits for adults, plus retirement pensions. The National Assistance Act of 1948 provided a safety net for those not otherwise covered. More council housing was built, and the plans were made through the New Towns Act 1946 for growth in the suburbs and to reduce overcrowding in major cities. The Attlee government nationalised about 20% of the economy, including coal, railways, road transport, the Bank of England, civil aviation, electricity and gas, and steel. However, there was no money for investment to modernise, and there was no effort made to turn control over to the workforce in these industries. Unfortunately, most of the 20% of the economy encompassed the most unprofitable part of it. Yet the previous owners received amounts in compensation for the nationalisation of their dilapidated and failing industries. The mines cost the taxpayer 164 million, electricity 540 million, etc. The railways 1 billion. There was anger on the shop floor over the manner in which the nationalisation was carried out. All management structures remained intact. Jobs for the boys at the top of the public sector replicated the old class structures of the privatised industries. Bullying was rife, and the tensions between workers and managers remained, as the workers did not feel they had any real say in how the companies were run. Between 1947 and 1951, there were over 8,000 unofficial strikes in the newly state-owned companies. The dilapidated nature of the companies prior to nationalisation contributed to the sense that state control was inefficient and bureaucratic, an argument that Margaret Thatcher and others were to deploy successfully in the 1980s. When the agreement between the union leaders and the Labour leaders failed to stop workers taking action over wages or working conditions, the Attlee government's attitude was that strikes against the Labour government were unacceptable, and it did not hesitate to use the army to break them. Between 1945 and 1951, the army was used on 18 separate occasions to break strikes. and the notorious strike-breaking Supply and Transport Organisation was secretly re-established. When the government turned to nationalisation of the very lucrative steel industry in 1948, it exposed the limits of consent, and opposition came from business, the lords, and the steel industry. And the combination was tantamount to a concerted effort to sabotage an act of parliament. The opposition ground down the nationalisation bill and the political will to implement it. When steel was eventually nationalised in the final phase of the Labour government in 1950, it was only a half-hearted attempt. In 1951, it was very easy for the new Conservative government to put iron and steel back into the private sector. The outcome of the fight over steel nationalisation was the Parliament Act of 1949, which limited the ability of the Lords to interfere in the Commons. This fell well short of the more radical proposals agreed in the 1930s that would have abolished the Lords entirely. In true British fashion, Attlee decided only to tinker around the edges. Been going nearly an hour now. Do you want to stop here and talk about it? Because there's quite a bit left. No? Anybody?
Yeah.
Because we're only, we've got the foreign policy and then the opposition, and we've got lots yet. And I've just noticed it's 8:10 and we started what, about 7:20?
Steve, would you like to continue it for the third week? Because you did say you were going to continue it 2 weeks.
Yeah. It might have to be
a third week, yeah, to do justice to all this work that you've done and all this
Brilliant.
that we've covered. Because you've covered
I mean,
the 1790s to 1951.
So we'll stop there for now.
Yeah.